Awesome. I think we're live. Welcome, everybody, to day 2 of SC Build. I'm so excited to be here today. Since many of you may be new to FC Build, let me start with a brief overview foundation. This is our second year hosting FC Build, and we couldn't be more excited. We are a early stage venture capital firm. We've been around for 26 years. We've had the pleasure of backing more than 30 portfolio companies that have gone public. In our enterprise practice, we partner with entrepreneurs working on problems up and down the stack, from cloud, data, AI, automation, DevOps, cybersecurity, vertical AI, just to name a couple of areas. We lead seeds and Series A's, usually before a company has any revenues or even a product. Basically, we invest in dreamers with big dreams and work with them to make them real. If that describes you, then please reach out to us. This conference is a learning experience from such dreamers who have achieved their dreams. And this is why I'm so excited to have Neha Narkhede with me today, who's a legendary founder who has built a legendary company. Welcome, Neha.
Thank you, Joanne. Really excited to be here.
For those of you who may not have met Neha, she is the co-founder and on the board of Confluent, which went public in June and is valued at more than $18 billion today. A huge, huge congrats to you.
Thank you. It's been a fun journey. It's been a fun journey. Thank you.
And we're going to dive deeper into that journey. Neha started Confluent in 2014 after co-creating Apache Kafka while she was at LinkedIn. And today she invests and advises startups. She studied computer science at Georgia Tech and grew up in Pune, India, although she lives in the Bay Area today. So Neha, maybe we'll start with your background a little bit more. What got you excited about the data space?
My career started at Oracle, where I worked on the database. But I think I got into the data space in a real way at LinkedIn while co-creating Kafka. LinkedIn was a very data-driven company, and the big problem was using real-time data at scale to enhance your user experiences, create more data-driven products. And of course, by co-founding Confluent, I continued that journey through our mission of putting data in motion. So perhaps the right way to say this is most of my career has been all about data.
That's good to hear. And at LinkedIn, what types of problems were you trying to solve?
I joined LinkedIn back in 2009, and back then there was nothing out there that could move data in real time and scale to billions of events and efficiently connect all the data sources and sinks in a company. So that's when we decided to create Kafka to sort of serve as a backbone of real time data at LinkedIn. And today it powers everything from stock exchanges to credit card processing to your car rides and beyond. And we thought that, with every company becoming a software company, it's going to lead to massive adoption of open source Kafka. And our thinking back then was that this wasn't just unique to LinkedIn. Digitization is a broader industry trend with every digital company needing a real time backbone. And so we open source Kafka to pretty much speed up its adoption.
Got it. That makes sense. What were some of the early maybe challenges as you were building Kafka and as the technology was gaining adoption in the beginning? What were some of the technology challenges that you saw then?
Yeah, Kafka started off with a very pragmatic industry use case at a real digital company like LinkedIn. So, really, the goal was to make it, available and make it useful for lots and lots of use cases at a company that was growing very fast. And so, really, I think most of the challenges beyond, picking the right architecture, which we probably did a good job of, was really working on making it practical, working through the bugs, making it easy to operate, just from the perspective of making the lives of our open source users a lot easier. And I think, originating in a real company and putting it into practice really helped in making Kafka successful for the broader community who could just download it and use it out of the box and I think that was one of the major reasons why Kafka was adopted so broadly, first in Silicon Valley and then, through its open source adoption in the broader industry. And, at some point it was clear that Kafka isn't just a real time message queue, it's going to become a core foundation for data in motion at companies of all kinds. And today, Kafka is used at more than 70% of the Fortune 500. So it's really been an amazing journey, and that investment at LinkedIn went a very long way in making Kafka successful.
Absolutely. Going back to the open source point, did you guys debate whether to actually make it open source at the time, or was this kind of obvious, just given what LinkedIn was hoping to achieve?
Yeah, LinkedIn had a very open source friendly culture. So there wasn't much of debate when we brought up our intention of open sourcing Kafka. And actually, there were a couple reasons why open sourcing it just made sense. First is it's a developer tool. Developers love hacking on open source projects a lot more than closed source ones. Of course, the SaaS and cloud adoption is changing this dynamic quite a bit, but there's a more significant reason to open source Kafka, which is that it's core infrastructure and it's meant to be a transformative foundation for all your data. To make that foundational a change happen and to get people on board on such a substantial mental model shift, open source is just a much stronger vehicle. And third, and other side of the other side of the open source coin is the realization that mental model shifts are best achieved with developer evangelism, and that is much more exciting for something that's open source. So when we looked at all these reasons, it was pretty clear that open sourcing Kafka in its early days would lead to the best chances to make it successful.
Makes a lot of sense. And we'll go back to the open source question, especially for founders in our audience who may be considering that as a strategy a little bit later. Now, going back to Confluent in the early days, you guys built this amazing technology in Kafka, you're seeing adoption, and then you decide to build a company out of that and leave LinkedIn. What was the early days like? What gave you that confidence? What was some of the trajectory you were seeing? Could you take us back there?
Yeah, Kafka had reached critical mass and was being adopted at enterprises for critical use cases. I remember a particular meeting where we were helping someone just out of the open source community, and it turned out that they were using Kafka for something really important in a very large company. So that's when, that was sort of a turning point for me to realize that in order to help Kafka reach the next level of adoption that it deserved, a commercial vehicle was just necessary and the next logical step. And also, personally, I didn't want to see someone else start the Kafka company, which it clearly was going to happen. So I think a bunch of reasons kind of led to, really recognizing what that critical point was and starting a company around it, which was really focused on just Kafka, making it successful, building all the right tooling, building a SaaS and a cloud native product. So it was pretty, clear when we saw that sort of adoption had reached critical mass.
When you say critical mass, how did you define it back then?
Yeah, there's no real formula. Our first concern was, would anyone adopt Kafka outside of LinkedIn? And it turned out that a lot of the big Silicon Valley tech companies adopted it. At which point, our next question was, well, will anyone who's conservative outside of Silicon Valley adopt it? And that started happening. And as that list grew, and we kept a close eye on who was adopting Kafka, it became clear when we got the first few name brands in a lot of industry verticals. That's when it was clear that, okay, in order to really expand across so many industry verticals, it just makes sense to have a commercial vehicle.
That makes sense. In the early days, you raised some money, I think about 7 million, to develop the first SaaS product on top of Kafka. And this is one of the big challenges I think that open source based companies are facing, which is how do you split resources, especially in the early days, between growing the community, right? You had a vibrant community, but still growing that versus spending time on your SaaS product uses. How did you think about that?
So, first and foremost, you approach this by truly believing in doing the right thing for the open source community and your customers. And that's the approach we took as well, is core foundational changes made it to the open source community. Features that would make it easy to adopt Kafka and use it out of the box made it into the open source community. Why? Because the community is really the place where the adoption of Kafka starts, and it has to have the right foundation, it has to have the right features to make that easy. At Confluent, we are really investing in functionality that makes sense for enterprises. Building a cloud native SaaS product that is less relevant for open source adoption. So I believe that you can strike this balance in a really natural way by aligning your product strategy to the respective users and end customer needs.
That makes sense. And you ran uh, technology and product since the very formation. And I think one of the hardest parts is making product decisions around what to keep as open source and what to charge for. What kind of processes did you follow to make those decisions?
So, one of the most impactful decisions at Confluent was the timing of building and introducing the cloud offering in
Mhm.
addition to the software one. So, where Kafka started and what it does is it really connects your data across all the places that it lives. And for a lot of enterprises, their data back then just lived on premise. And that's just where we had to start. But that critical point where we realize that this is going to move and shift very quickly to the public cloud, and when you go there the product looks very different. So on the front, we really focused on not just building the necessary tooling that helped companies required to become successful with Kafka, but largely also invest in that next, step function where customers were going, and sort of really figuring that journey out and following that journey and creating a product strategy around that was really critical from the perspective of making Confluent successful in addition to serving our open source community.
Makes sense. And related to that, there are probably key KPIs that you followed, either on the R&D side, right, and as well as the business development and growth side. What were some of those KPIs?
We watch the adoption rate of Kafka, and we still do very, very closely, and hired for developer evangelism in the very early days. In fact, we're also fortunate to get engineers who are very good at evangelism. And I think that is a vehicle of KPIs and focus that will just never go away, and it never should. And that we see is sort of the precursor to our commercial adoption. And so on the go to market side in the early days, we hired sales reps that could actually hunt down these open source deployments, convert them into commercial customers of Confluent. And these two investments took us very far in building a successful business on top of the open source Kafka product. And from there on, it's scaling on the go to market side, like every company has to do, geo expansion, building the next offering. For us, it was the cloud native offering. And now we're happy to see that grow and really make our customers successful.
In the early days, when you think about hiring, right, you talk about developer evangelism, you talked about go to market, some of the go to market hires. What early roles do you think are key? And this is especially relevant to our early stage founders as they think about hiring their first go to market folks.
If you think about companies that are focused on open source versus companies that start with a product that is not open source, I think this hiring strategy just looks very, very different. For companies that don't start with an open source product, it's usually engineering heavy. You really focus with a small and nimble team, get design partners, make them successful, get the next set of product partners, and really scale the adoption to maybe beyond 1 million in revenue ARR, where you realize that okay, now it's more about scaling. We do have some product market fit. On the open source side, it looks really different. We have to invest in developer evangelism pretty early on to make that open source product successful, and just realize that that investment pays off in the long term, and has to be a precursor to all the go to market investments.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, one of the key things that open source based companies really need to think about, from the early days is, in addition to engineering investment, you need to have this developer evangelism investment from the really early days, right from the genesis, I would say, of the company.
That makes a lot of sense. When you talked about go to market and finding in your Kafka customer base the right Confluent customers, what were some of the things that you guys looked for, and what were good targets versus not in the early days of go to market?
In the early days, we looked at production deployments of open source Kafka for critical use cases where companies would be, more, encouraged or more so looking for a commercial offering to kind of help them, catch the errors and make it successful, and really more of an insurance policy. And that really goes pretty far, hunting down production deployments. And this was more to do with the timing of starting Confluent. Kafka was already out there for about 3.5, 4 years and had really taken off. So hunting down these production open source deployments was a tad bit easier for Confluent. It may or may not be as easy in the early days of an open source based company that had just open sourced something. So it does take about 3 to 4 years to hit this kind of adoption and this kind of go to market strategy. That really worked out from the early days. The other thing we did was really get some of these tech companies and the brand logos as customers, just because it helped attract the next stage of customers that really looked up to those companies, and use them as sort of a precursor to their own success.
That makes a lot of sense. And to your point around the timing of open sourcing, many companies today that are starting off are open sourcing as they're also working on their commercial strategy, which is a different experience than Kafka and Confluence evolution. How do you think things would differ in that situation, or any advice for founders who are taking a slightly different journey from you, given where
I
you were?
think the first thing that you want to realize if you're just starting off with an open source offering and a commercial one is really this value proposition thesis of what the open source community really would need in order to get started and become reasonably successful, and what would that lead to as a next step in their own journey of making this practical in a real company and an enterprise. And I think one of the advantages of doing this in parallel is you get to really refine that thesis as you grow both the project as well as the commercial offering. And that sort of flexibility can go a long way in helping the company be strategic in making these decisions. So I think that's actually an advantage of starting both at the same time. We of course had a different journey where we had the advantage of broad scale adoption before starting a company, and that really de-risked the company in a really big way.
That makes sense. And the question of open source is also a good one. I mean, in that situation, there's probably a bigger debate around whether to open source or not, right? If you're doing both the commercial and open source at the same time. Any thoughts on how to approach that question?
Yeah, I think realizing that platforms, in order to get broader adoption and in order to reduce this fear of getting locked into a platform, is real. And maybe that is one of the key, hints that point to open sourcing that project versus you're building on top of a platform, making a tool available however big of a problem that that tool could solve, the metrics or the sort of rubric of making that decision really changes. So I would say the biggest thing is foundational changes or a platform strategy really
Mhm.
points to more of an open source approach, just because it makes it way easier to get people bought in. Now with the cloud taking off, cloud native offerings becoming the core starting point, some of the open source strategies changing. It's more so changing to open APIs with maybe a closed source platform that's fully managed. But again, in that case, you really have to weigh the consequences of not open sourcing something that's a platform versus the tool. So
Yeah.
really, I think that's one of the major sort of differentiating factors in whether something is open source or not.
That's really good advice. I'm going to introduce a few questions from the audience, and then we can keep on going as the company scales, since this is relevant here. So I think Diana had a question around developer evangelism investment that you mentioned earlier. How did you think about that in terms of the investment, either its compensation or what's the best way to motivate these folks, whether they're inside the company or outside?
I think your self-selecting talent that understands the importance of open sourcing something and the role that developer evangelism plays in that. So really that role is not not much different from a full-time, an engineer who's
Yeah.
tasked with making the product successful. The product won't be successful without the hand in hand investment in developer evangelism. So really I think motivating developer evangelists are is not very different from motivating engineers. The metrics of course are different. Developer evangelists are usually measured, if not paid, on evangelism adoption metrics,
Yeah.
but that's a form of motivating them, but not so much through financial incentives. It's more so product goals and metrics.
That makes sense. So let's fast forward a little bit to the growth of the company, right? This is, we talk about early days a little bit, and as you scaled teams, as you scaled the commercial side, can you tell us a bit about some of the considerations and some of the biggest challenges?
I think there are multiple challenges for a company that's based on an open source offering. You can never really take your eye off the ball on the open source community. That's actually a big investment. And the question is, what does engineering focus on? How do you even organize an engineering team when you have an open source core, an open core strategy where you're building a product around something that's open source? And how do you, build that? How do you deploy that? How do you, make sure engineering is moving fast? And there the choice isn't clear whether you split engineering or you really have a cohesive engineering team that's moving in lockstep towards the goal. So that's, I think, one of the hardest things. The other really difficult thing is on the go to market side. When you have a SaaS offering and a software one, and customers are shifting from one to the other, how do you organize like a consumption based model that allows you to retire credits, some on the software offering, some on the SaaS offering? And that's a trend that the whole sort of industry is moving toward. That's not very easy to navigate if you're making that change. If you're starting as a cloud native product, all this is actually much easier, minus the pain of scaling companies, which never goes away. It's just much easier to scale a product and go to market if there's just one offering
Yep.
that is cloud native.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to your engineering comment and how you think about structuring engineering teams, what did you decide, and what made sense for Confluent back then?
What made sense is, organizing open source, success along with the product and commercial success. So we really decided that those are not two separate things. We will only succeed if both of these end users are ultimately successful. And we also didn't want an engineering culture that kind of sees these two things differently, that sees open source success any better from commercial success, or the other way around. And just because of these two reasons, we decided to have a cohesive engineering team, and put the burden on product and product strategy to really organize and prioritize things. And I think that worked out really well from a cultural standpoint, for both our community as well as Confluent.
Makes sense. Actually, there's a question somewhat related to the structure that Kirsten asked, which is, does a hybrid model, strategy make sense? And this applies to both, go to market as well as how do you structure an organization, and are there risks to that? And by hybrid, meaning on-premise service and SaaS together.
Yeah, I think the way you would decide whether you want hybrid or not is really to study your customer journey and figure out where they are and where they want to be next. And that is one of the core things that should guide the product strategy. And let's say the answer to that is hybrid, then that's what it needs to be. And it's one of the hardest companies to build, is to have a hybrid offering that's on-prem as well as cloud native, because the way you ship the product, develop the product on-prem is very different from how you would ship to a cloud native product. The way you would sell an on-prem offering is very different from the way you would sell a cloud native offering. So if the answer is hybrid, you want to arrive at it from first principles thinking, from really studying your customer journey and giving it deep thought on the strategy to sort of overcome all the challenges. And that's probably one of the hardest companies to build, I would say.
Makes a lot of sense. I'm going to take another question from the audience before we get on to our next topic. Steve asked, you recently changed your license approach along with Elastic and Cockroach. Can you talk about that in relation to the likes of AWS, Azure? Any comments on that?
So we see these big public cloud providers as partners, really, and making Kafka successful through a cloud native offering just makes sense for Confluence customers. Helping Kafka adopt in the broader world through a Kafka offering just makes sense for AWS customers and Azure customers. And really both the companies would partner up in making sure they do the right thing for their customers. And we're a big user of AWS, and we really see making the lives of AWS customers successful if they choose the cloud native offering of Confluent, really an important strategy. And so I think this is, a balance that you need to strike between the relationship you want to have with the cloud providers and what that means to, your licensing and product strategy. We see this as doing the best thing for the company, and also doing the best thing for the open source community is to still, incentivize and encourage developers to, sort of develop the open source community, and be able to then provide like an a la carte commercial offerings that they can pick and make their lives successful. Really, that is where the strategy should derive from, rather than the other way around.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to make sure we cover some of your experiences as a founder of a massively scaling company, right? There's an open source piece, which is unique. And there's, obviously all the scaling challenges of being a first-time founder. Can you share some of the lessons? Like, how did you learn how to grow even more quickly than the company did?
That's a pretty hard question. I think the biggest quality, or the biggest sort of investment, I realized, is persistence. Right? Is just humility and persistence to know that you don't know everything, and the fact that you're going to learn as you grow the company really requires a ton of persistence, because you're learning every day, you're probably failing every day. And having a growth mindset, I think, went very far in my own personal journey of growing as a founder while scaling a very rapidly scaling company. So I think that was sort of the main thing that I realized and helped me personally grow along with the company.
Any tactics related to that? For example, mentors, coaches, advisors, people around the table. How does someone learn to grow?
Personally, my approach is to first of all read everything there is to read about whatever I'm trying to learn. So if it's sales, read a ton of books on how it could be structured, what works, what doesn't work. So I spend a ton of time reading, and reaching out to experts in the space to, let's say, advise you or advise the company, and really learn from their mistakes and their own experience. Those two things went very far in helping me and also helping the company navigate some of these big questions.
Absolutely. How about on the hiring side? The first time hiring specific leaders, whether it's engineering or product or go to market, any lessons learned there? Who's the right profile, and how frequently do you think about a new leader? Any lessons there?
Yeah, I think the most important things that you could do is to hire a really strong and amazing engineering team with the right culture. And one of the advantages, particularly while we're on the topic of open source, that open source companies have is they have watched many engineers develop products and that are relevant to them, and they can actually tap into their own community to say, hey, you already love Kafka, would you like to work for the Kafka company?
It's a great
And
recruiting tactic.
yes, and that was a really effective strategy for Confluent, and I've seen that work very well for companies that are like Confluent. So really taking advantage of the open source community like we did was crucial for us. Hiring engineers that were also up for doing some amount of evangelism, because really, for a platform and for a technology company like Confluent, hearing from the engineers about what they've built and why they built it was really important, in addition to sort of amplifying that through developer evangelism. So we handpicked people who wrote really good blog posts and actually went after them and convinced them to join Confluent. And even a handful of them went a very long way in making our evangelism strategy successful. On the go to market side, it's pretty much following your customers and really scaling along with them, and that, I think, is a little more programmatic. It's a little more sort of written down in terms of a formula. But yeah, I think from an engineering perspective, that probably is the biggest challenge to solve. And personally, the lesson I learned was, in order to scale engineering hiring, you really need to hire another partner who can help sort of bring in people in addition to the founders taking up most of the workload. And hiring a VP engineering or hiring a senior engineering partner early on would have been helpful, I think, in really splitting that load.
Makes sense. Any tips on the profile to look for that engineering partner? We get this question asked a lot from our founders.
It profile should align with the what the product needs, right? So from our perspective, it's a complex distributed systems, and for us to have an effective engineering leader, we really needed them to have the right experience building, scalable distributed systems and a scalable platform. So that was sort of that probably should be the first factor, and the other factor is if they have scaled rapidly in their previous jobs, right? Like started from a small team and just in a couple years scaled that to maybe hundreds of engineers. So really, looking for VPs or looking for engineering leaders who might have looked at or might have scaled to the next stage that you need to scale to in the next year or two is probably the right fit. And the third is they just have to align with the founders and the existing engineering culture and be consistent. with that. Those are probably the three factors from an engineering perspective.
Makes a lot of sense. If you look at the other angle of the business, around financing and then raising more capital through the public markets, what was your experience like in the early days of that, in terms of fundraising from venture, to start with?
When we started Confluent, a lot of the venture community was familiar with the success of Kafka and what it means in terms of de-risking a company around it. So I would say we had probably an unusually, simpler, easier way to raise funding in the early days. Of course, what we had as Series A is more of a seed now, and all the round sizes are changing really, big way. But yeah, I think we had an unusually straightforward path to fundraising, given how successful the open source project already was.
That makes sense, and very glad to hear that. We have another question around the initial response and developer engagement. I'm just going to put it up. There we go. What was this? Any secret sauce for the initial response and developer engagement for the first project? Did you spend a lot of resources educating the community? And this is probably more related to the early days of Kafka and also the early days of commercial Confluent.
In a big way, I think the secret sauce is probably consistency of developer evangelism and being able to do that at some reasonable cadence that you can keep up with, and really investing in engineering time in evangelism. So the secret sauce really is to establish that cadence and track metrics around blog post engagement and whether that was actually helpful or not, and really refine that strategy to hit a cadence of quality that will go a long way in helping people be successful and helping people understand that mental model shift.
A follow-up question, I had is, when you first started commercializing Confluent, how did you think about the value proposition as it relates to pricing? This is such a tough thing to figure out, and our experience is that our companies don't really get this right, not at the seed stage, not the Series A, and probably not even the Series C. How did you think about it, and any lessons learned there?
I think pricing experts are probably going to say the same thing as I've heard from Madhavan before, who's a pricing expert. Is there's just no formula around getting pricing right.
Right.
It's a combination of art and science, and usually pricing trends upwards as you grow the company. And pricing should align with the product positioning, right? Are you positioning it as a value offering or not, would really guide the starting point of where your pricing would be as compared to competitors. So I think getting comfortable with the fact that you're not going to get pricing right and in the early days, and you're really going to keep changing it as the company grows, and feeling okay, not knowing what the strategy really should be. It's more of an iterative process, just like product market fit is a very iterative process.
Can you share a few examples how you guys thought about it, and how that has changed?
I think no real sort of formula around it. There were benchmarks around what open source on-prem offerings would charge on a node basis, and there were benchmarks around what a value offering could be on a cloud offering. And really, you study those benchmarks, and knowing that Confluent is a value offering, you go from there.
Yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. We keep telling folks you're going to be wrong. That's why we know that's for sure going to be true. So keep iterating. That's fantastic. How about in the early days, when you think about some of the maybe mistakes, going back to again sharing your wisdom for early stage founders, anything you would have done differently?
From what perspective? Because there are so many things in a company building that
Yeah, and
to talk about.
I think it's, we talked about pricing a little bit. That's iterative. There's leadership hiring. You talked about bringing on a VP of engineering possibly sooner. Any other such roles, for example, or any possible changes in timing of strategy?
In the early days of the company, you're really involved in hiring, and you're going to meet every single candidate. And as the company grows, it sometimes can get off your radar. But I think that as the company grows, what I've done that I found useful is to still make time for certain key mid senior level leaders, in addition to just the senior leaders, because mid senior folks are going to be really crucial in preserving the core culture of the company,
Mhm.
and still making time for meeting them, interviewing them really does go a long way in helping scale the culture of the company. I think similarly in the early days you might be much more involved in the details and details of product development, and as the company scales, just realizing that you're not going to be in as many details, but really making sure that you still have a finger on the pulse is hard, and to realize that balance is really hard. And you still have to be comfortable with the fact that you're not going to be in all the details, and you just have to scale through other leaders and give them room and space to flourish.
Absolutely. You bring in a good point, which is how do you set culture? And culture is arguably more important than strategy. It's what drives the company forward. What were some of the cultural values of Confluent?
One of the most important values is customer love for Confluent. And that basically centers around knowing and anchoring around customer success, whatever that might mean in terms of product or go to market or challenge, overcoming the challenges. So that's probably the most important. Some of the other values center around people. We look for smart, humble, empathetic folks, and we really want to drive that point home. Is That's the culture that we started with, and that's the kind of people we want to bring in even as we scale. And then there are a lot more around getting stuff done quickly, making sure we can still move fast, thoughtfully, and so on. But primarily you want to have some focus on customers that is core to the company and people.
That makes sense. Customer love is one that we keep hearing over and over again. And different companies deal with customer love in different ways, right? So there's a lot of cross functional cooperation and working together to make sure there is that love. What did that look like at Confluent? Maybe give us a few specific examples of how do you ensure customer love?
It is something that starts with the founders, I think, in setting the right tone and setting the right priorities, because there's always big trade-offs that you want to make as you grow the company. And it's just a common thread that has to run from product and engineering all the way to, partnerships, all the way to customer success and sales. And it really comes down to making the big and the difficult decisions, right? That's kind of one bucket of things that should be guided by customer love. And the other thing is to make continuous improvements and to make continuous, iteration, and that should be guided by customer feedback, right? Largely. And I think these are the two categories, big categories that you want to debate and really, establish a process around for the second one.
Yep, absolutely. We have a question around the open source community and diversity, which I'm going to address. Any thoughts on increasing diversity? You're one of the kind of few role models, a very good role model for women here. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is a really tough problem. I felt like I was, one of the very few people navigating this, and it was truly challenging from the early days to the later ones, because there are just very few role models. And I think one of the things that could help bring in more diversity is, focus on inclusion in the open source community and setting the right tone as creators of that open source project. And I think inclusion is a tough thing to solve for, right? There are a lot of discussions and debates in the open source community, but making room to hear everyone out is just practically one of the things to be able to do. Once people have been heard and get the right feedback, irrespective of their backgrounds, that actually probably goes the longest way in building diversity in an open source community. But there are many bad examples of projects that have not done this right. You can just read their discussions and how they digress. But yeah, I think we made it a point to give it our best shot in the Kafka open source community.
That makes a lot of sense. Neha, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask just one last question before we go. Any last pieces of advice for founders that are starting off?
Um, you know, maybe one advice is, persistence and determination, and just somehow finding the strength to work through every little and large challenge that comes your way. Second is be super customer focused and market focused, and follow the customers and their requirements back to the product, rather than building something and then going to market. Those would be two. And the third one is never take eyes of the ball on people, and building the right culture and making sure the right people come in.
And I love that you talked about your growth mindset and how to focus on that along the way. So thank you so much. Thank you for building Kafka, building Confluent, and being a role model for all of us. Really appreciate you speaking. And I learned a ton. I think our founders and our audience very much enjoyed this conversation.
Thank
Thank you.
you. I really loved the experience too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.